Elijah Carter had the kind of presence that made strangers lower their voices when he walked by. In a small southern town like Hawthorne, Georgia, a man like him wasn't just respected. He was trusted in the kind of deep, old-fashioned way people reserve for doctors, teachers, and pastors. Every Sunday morning, he stepped up to the pulpit in his crisp white shirt, his polished brown shoes, and that soft, steady voice that felt more like a warm porch light than a sermon. And when he spoke about patience, forgiveness, or turning the other cheek, folks didn't just hear him. They believed him. But the version of Elijah the town adored wasn't the same man his wife woke up next to every morning. Sienna Carter used to be proud to stand beside him. 10 years younger, radiant, full of fire. When they first married, people said they balanced each other. She was passionate. He was calm. She lit up a room. He steadied it. Back then, Sienna believed calmness meant strength. She thought she'd found a man who could anchor her, someone who would protect her from the chaos she'd grown up with. But reality had a cruel way of showing her the difference between steady and absent. Behind the walls of their modest, one-story home, the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Elijah was the kind of husband who prayed before every meal, who kept his clothes neatly folded, who whispered scripture under his breath when the world frustrated him. But he wasn't the kind of husband who pressed his wife against the counter when she danced in the kitchen. He wasn't the kind who pulled her close in the middle of the night just because he wanted to feel her breathe. If she leaned in to kiss him a little longer, he'd smile gently and murmur something about keeping their marriage holy. Holy, that was his favorite word. To Sienna, it started to sound like an excuse. She remembered being 24, newly married, lying in a hotel room on their honeymoon, while Elijah kissed her forehead like she was made of porcelain. He touched her like she might shatter, not like a woman he'd dreamed about for months. She told herself he was nervous. That passion would come later. But later never came. Not in the first year, not in the third, not even in the ninth. Every time she tried to talk about it, really talk, not joke around or hint, Elijah froze. He offered explanations that sounded holy but felt hollow. I want to honor you. I want our union to remain pure. I don't want sin to creep into the way I love you. It wasn't that Elijah didn't care. He did, deeply. But the kind of intimacy Sienna craved wasn't something he knew how to give. He prayed about desire the way other men prayed about forgiveness, like it was something dangerous he needed to keep locked up. Sienna tried. God knows she tried. She wore dresses Elijah used to compliment. She lit candles, played slow music, planned weekend trips, cooked his favorite meals. She tried being softer, then bolder, then quieter, then louder. Nothing reached him. The more she reached out, the more he retreated into his devotion, as if loving her physically meant betraying his faith. Meanwhile, her own faith in him, in their marriage, started to crack. There were nights Sienna lay facing the wall, blinking back tears while Elijah whispered prayers beside her. Nights when she felt like some kind of ghost bride, sharing a bed but not a life. Sometimes she'd look at him in the dark and whisper, "Do you even want me?" But he never heard. He was busy asking God to bless a marriage she felt was already slipping through her fingers. Outside their home, Elijah was everything a pastor should be: wise, grounded, patient. Women in town baked him pies just to thank him for counseling their families. Men shook his hand twice because once didn't feel respectful enough. People said things like, "Sienna's lucky. He's one of the good ones. A man like that is a rare blessing." She never corrected them because she knew something they didn't. A good man isn't always a good husband. Still, for years, she stayed loyal. She told herself that intimacy wasn't everything, that marriage was more than physical touch. But deep down, she missed feeling alive. She missed being seen as a woman, not as a fragile soul to be protected. She missed passion, the kind that makes your pulse jump, the kind that reminds you you're human. And then one morning, while she was folding laundry and Elijah sat at the table with a Bible open between them, she realized she hadn't felt desired in almost a decade. Not once, not fully, not honestly. A marriage can survive a lot. Arguments, bills, stress, even silence. But it can't survive being untouched. What neither of them knew was that the quiet breaking inside Sienna would soon collide with the quiet breaking inside Elijah. Their marriage wasn't dying. It was a fuse burning from both ends. And in Hawthorne, Georgia, where everyone believed Elijah Carter was the gentlest man alive, no one could have imagined that this slow, silent unraveling was the beginning of a tragedy that would eventually leave blood on a neighbor's floor, tears on a church altar, and a town wondering how a man so holy could carry so much hidden fire. Darius Holt moved into Hawthorne on a Tuesday, hot, humid, the kind of day where the air felt thick enough to hold a grudge. His arrival didn't cause a stir at first. He was just another newcomer hauling dumbbells, protein tubs, and a worn-out weight bench from the back of a pickup truck. But for Sienna Carter, standing behind her living room blinds with a laundry basket on her hip, that moment felt like a fault line shifting under her feet. She didn't know why she kept watching. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe boredom, maybe something deeper, something she'd been trying to ignore for years. Whatever it was, she couldn't look away. Darius was everything Elijah wasn't. Where Elijah moved like a whisper, Darius moved like a drumbeat. Heavy, confident, certain. He was 38, all shoulders and biceps. The kind of build you don't get from casual gym visits, but from years of discipline and maybe a few broken punching bags. His skin glistened under the Georgia sun, sweat tracing down the edges of muscles Sienna forgot men could have. A tattoo wrapped around one arm, half hidden under the sleeve of his tank top, and he wiped his forehead with a towel that looked like it barely survived the job. The contrast was impossible to ignore. That morning, Elijah was sitting at the kitchen table reading through sermon notes, lips moving silently as he underlined passages with a yellow highlighter. He looked peaceful, holy, untouched by desire. Meanwhile, across the street, Darius dropped a 40-pound dumbbell onto his driveway, the thud echoing like a heartbeat Sienna hadn't felt in years. Maybe that was the moment things began to shift. The first interaction was accidental. Sienna was pulling into her driveway after work when she saw Darius still outside, adjusting his bench press. She stepped out of her car at the exact moment he wiped sweat from his neck, giving her a clear view she absolutely wasn't supposed to linger on, but did anyway. He caught her looking, and instead of pretending he didn't, he smiled. Not a polite smile, a knowing one. "Afternoon," he called. His voice was deep, smooth, confident, the kind of voice that made you wonder what it sounded like in the dark. Sienna blinked, flustered. "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood." He nodded, eyes never leaving hers. "Appreciate it." She walked inside too fast, heart pounding like she'd done something wrong when all she did was say hello. But she felt it. Something had shifted in her chest. Something she thought was long dead. Over the next few days, the universe kept placing them in each other's orbit. Sienna taking out the trash, Darius jogging, shirtless past her driveway. Sienna picking up a package, Darius offering to carry it with one hand like it weighed nothing. Sienna getting her mail, Darius leaning against his truck, smirking like he knew she'd glance over. None of it was scandalous. Not yet, but the air between them buzzed with possibility. The turning point came on a Saturday morning. Elijah had left early for a men's prayer retreat, the kind where they spent hours talking about spiritual warfare and accountability. Sienna stayed home, cleaning the garage, trying to distract herself from the ache she no longer knew how to silence. She tugged at a heavy storage box, but it barely budged. Before she could try again, a shadow appeared beside her. "You need help with that?" Darius asked, stepping into the garage like he'd been invited. She startled. "Oh, it's okay. I got it." He raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She wasn't. Not physically and not emotionally. But she stepped aside anyway. He lifted the box effortlessly, muscles tightening under his shirt. She pretended not to stare, but she did. And so did he. "What's in this?" "Bricks," he joked. "Old books," she said, laughing a little too quickly. That laugh hung in the air, light, nervous, electric. He noticed. "You laugh like you forgot how," he said softly. Her heart skipped. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "Just sounds like you needed it." It was a simple comment, but it hit her harder than she expected. She had forgotten. She'd forgotten how to laugh, how to flirt, how to feel anything besides neglected. Darius didn't try to hide that he liked the way she looked. Elijah used to tell her she was beautiful, but he said it like a prayer, gentle, reverent, distant. Darius said it with his eyes, bold and unashamed, like a man who wasn't afraid of wanting. A few days later, Sienna caught him watching her through the blinds as she headed to her car. She didn't turn away this time. She let him look. She let him see her. That small moment, barely a second, felt more intimate than anything she'd shared with her husband in years. One evening, as she stood at the sink washing dishes, she heard heavy clanking metal from across the street. She looked through the window. Darius was doing deadlifts in his driveway, shirt off, sweat pouring down his chest, each rep hitting her like a pulse. She whispered to herself, "Stop looking," but she didn't. The truth was simple and dangerous. Elijah made her feel safe, but Darius made her feel alive. And in a town where everyone knew your business, Sienna Carter suddenly found herself craving the one thing her marriage had never given her: heat. She didn't know it yet, but the man across the street wasn't just a new neighbor. He was the beginning of the end. It started on a day that didn't feel dangerous. That's the truth Sienna Carter would later admit to herself. There was no storm, no fight, no dramatic turning point. Just a humid Georgia afternoon, the kind that made the air heavy and judgment slow. Elijah was away at a men's retreat, preaching about resisting temptation, while Sienna stood barefoot in her kitchen, squeezing lemons for a pitcher she didn't plan to drink alone. Her phone buzzed. "Darius, you out?" 2 words. Nothing sinful on their own, but they sent a jolt straight through her chest. Her fingers hesitated only a second before she typed back, "Come by." Back doors unlocked. The decision didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like breathing after years underwater. When the back door opened minutes later, she didn't jump. She didn't ask why he didn't knock. The way he walked in, like he belonged there, shook something loose inside her that had been locked up far too long. Sienna bent to place the lemonade in the fridge, her robe slipping slightly. She felt his presence behind her before she heard him, a heat radiating from his skin that made her pulse jump. Then Darius stepped forward and put his hands on her hips. No hesitation, no shyness, no prayers, just want. The kind of want she hadn't tasted in 9 years. Later, she would try to replay the exact moment she stopped resisting, but the truth was she never resisted at all. She melted. The cold, neglected part of her cracked open like glass under pressure. They didn't make it to the bedroom. The kitchen counter was enough, the wall was enough, the floor was enough. After so many years of being touched like porcelain, she felt like a woman again, warm, desired, devoured. When it was over, she stood trembling, staring at the half-empty lemonade glass she'd left on the counter. Her chest rose and fell too fast. Her robe hung crooked. Her heartbeat sounded like a warning she refused to read. Darius wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You needed that," he whispered. "And God help her," she didn't argue. But guilt came later, as it always does. It crept in while she showered, scrubbing her skin until it turned pink. It lingered when she changed the bed sheets. It smothered her when Elijah came home hours later smelling like pine trees and prayer. She smiled at him, lied with ease, slipped back into the familiar role of the pastor's wife. But something inside her had changed. The next time was easier. Darius texted her on a Tuesday afternoon while she folded laundry. "Can't stop thinking about you." The message made her throat tighten. Elijah was humming a gospel song in the next room, unaware, untouched, unreachable. She stared at her phone for a long moment before replying. "Tomorrow, noon." That time, they made it to the bedroom. The same bed where Elijah folded his hands and whispered blessings each night. The same sheets where he touched her with reverence instead of hunger. The same pillows where she cried quiet tears he never noticed. With Darius, there were no prayers. Only heat. Only breath. Only the electricity she thought she'd lost forever. When they finished, Darius brushed Sienna's hair from her face and said things Elijah never could. "Damn, girl, you're a firestorm. You still got it. Why he let a woman like you sleep cold every night?" Those words were gasoline. Dangerous. Addictive. They filled cracks she'd stopped acknowledging years ago. And so the pattern began. Wednesday afternoons. Friday mornings. Some Mondays if Elijah had deacons meetings. Their affair wasn't love. It was hunger. A hunger that had been starved for too long. Sienna tried to tell herself it was just physical, that it would stop any day now, that she wasn't risking everything for a man with a smile that felt like a dare. But Darius wasn't just a distraction. He became a mirror, reflecting the version of herself she wanted to believe still existed. A woman who was wanted. A woman who was alive. A woman who could set fire to a man just by walking into the room. There were moments, fleeting, dangerous moments, when she caught herself smiling after leaving his house. Moments when she fixed her hair in her car mirror before going back home. Moments when she whispered "stop it" to herself, but didn't mean a word of it. Shame came afterward, yes, but the shame still felt better than the numbness. The numbness was what Elijah gave her. The shame was what Darius awakened. And between the two, she chose the one that made her feel something. The affair grew reckless, riskier, more frequent. Darius started to want more than stolen afternoons. One day, as they lay tangled in sheets, Elijah had never touched her this passionately Darius said, "You ever think about leaving him?" Sienna laughed too loudly, the sound sharp and panicked. "That's not part of the plan," she said. "Maybe it should be." She froze. That was the moment she realized something terrifying. This wasn't just an affair anymore. It was an escape, a doorway, a spark with nowhere safe to burn. But she didn't stop, because deep down, she didn't want to. Sienna Carter hadn't just stepped out of her marriage. She'd stepped into a version of herself she didn't recognize and didn't want to let go of. She didn't know it yet, but every secret text, every whispered lie, every slammed door, every stolen hour in Darius's bed was stacking into a weight Elijah would eventually discover. And when he did, the fire she thought she could control would consume everything. Elijah Carter never meant to snoop. That's what he would tell himself later. That's what good men tell themselves when they stumble into the kind of truth that unravels a marriage in a single breath. But on that quiet Wednesday night, the house felt strangely still. Sienna was in the shower, humming a song he didn't recognize, and her iPad buzzed on the kitchen counter. A notification lit up the screen, just enough for Elijah to see the first word. Darius. He froze. In 10 years of marriage, he had never once seen a man's name pop up on her lock screen. Family? Female friends? Sure. But Darius? The new neighbor? The man with the too easy smile and the kind of build Elijah had lost long ago? He shouldn't have touched it. He knew that. But curiosity, no, fear, move his hand before faith could stop him. The iPad unlocked without a passcode. And there it was. A cascade of messages. Pictures. Voice notes. The truth spilled out faster than he could process it. He stared at a photo of Sienna, one she'd taken in their bedroom mirror, wearing the robe he'd bought her last Christmas. Not posed, not staged, intimate in a way Elijah had never seen from her. Below it, Darius had replied, "Damn, baby, I can't wait until he's gone again." Elijah felt something inside him fracture. A silent break, sharp but quiet. His heartbeat hammered in his ears as he scrolled. "Sienna, I feel alive with you." Darius, because he doesn't know how to touch you like a real man. "Sienna, don't say that, even though it's true." Elijah's grip tightened on the device. He felt his throat close like someone had shoved a fist into his chest. Still, he kept reading, kept digging into the grave his marriage had become. Then he clicked a voice note. Sienna's whisper poured into his ear like poison. "Elijah is a good man, but you're the one who makes me feel like a woman." The iPad slipped from his hands and hit the table with a dull thud. Everything went still. The shower water shut off. Sienna's humming faded. Elijah didn't move. His body felt foreign, heavy, trembling with something he'd never known before. Not anger, not sadness. Something deeper. A hollowing. His wife walked out, wrapped in a towel, hair dripping. She saw the iPad on the table, saw Elijah's face. Her smile faltered, collapsing into dread. "Elijah, I can explain." He looked at her like she was a stranger standing in his kitchen. "No," he said quietly. "You can't." Sienna stepped toward him, but he raised a hand. Not in anger, just a small, devastated gesture asking her to stop. "How long?" His voice barely held together. She swallowed. A few months. The truth wasn't just an answer. It was a blow. Elijah inhaled sharply like she'd punched the air out of his lungs. Where? He asked. The pause before she answered was too long. Here. Elijah. He shut his eyes. It was confirmation enough. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't curse or cry. Instead, he walked past her, upstairs to their bedroom, moving like a man twice his age. Sienna stood frozen, wrapped in a towel in silence, knowing the next words she spoke could never undo what he'd seen. Upstairs, Elijah sat on the edge of their bed, hands clasped, staring at the framed wedding picture on the nightstand. The two of them smiling in the Georgia sun, young and hopeful, unaware of the slow suffocation coming for them. He whispered to himself, I tried to love you the best way I knew how, but even he knew it wasn't enough. Not for her, not for the marriage, not for the woman who had begged him, in her own quiet ways, to see her, to want her. And he had failed. He reached for his Bible out of habit, flipping it open as if the pages might stitch him back together. But the words blurred. His hands shook. A verse echoed in his mind. Jealousy is the rage of a man. He will not spare in the day of vengeance. He closed the book. Hard. That night, Elijah didn't pray. He couldn't. The words would not come. He sat awake for hours, staring at the darkness, listening to Sienna cry softly downstairs. His heart throbbed with a mixture of grief and something darker, a foreign heat rising through the cracks of his faith. Around 3 a.m., he walked to the storage room, opened a dusty wooden chest, and wrapped his hand around the handle of the old wooden baseball bat a youth group had gifted him years ago. He held it upright, feeling the weight, the grain of the wood, the grip worn smooth where hands had once swung it with innocence. Tonight, it felt different. It felt like purpose. Not righteous, not holy, but inevitable. Elijah Carter had spent his life preaching forgiveness. But in this moment, this raw, fractured, bleeding moment, he discovered a truth he had never spoken aloud. Even the kindest men have a breaking point, and he had reached his. Elijah Carter woke before sunrise, though he'd barely slept. His body felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything soft and human and left only the shape of a man behind. The house was silent. Sienna hadn't come upstairs. He didn't know if she fell asleep on the couch or lay awake, drowning in guilt. It didn't matter. Nothing she could say now would change the truth he carried like a stone in his chest. He dressed in silence, button-down shirt, slacks, shoes polished from years of Sunday habit. He looked like a pastor preparing for a funeral, and in a way, he was. Just not the kind that required flowers. Downstairs, he paused by the storage closet. His fingers hovered over the handle before pulling it open. The baseball bat lay exactly where he left it the night before. Smooth wood, slightly worn grip, light enough to lift with one hand but heavy enough to end a life. His hand curled around it. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like an answer. Outside, the sky was pale and washed out, the kind of morning where even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Elijah walked across the street with deliberate, unhurried steps. Anyone watching might think he was heading to offer prayer, to comfort a neighbor, to perform some quiet act of grace. But grace had abandoned him hours ago. Darius Holt's truck sat in the driveway, still damp from the night air. Music thumped faintly from inside the house. Workout music, upbeat, careless. Elijah stood at the door for a full 5 seconds before raising his hand. 3 knocks. Firm. Measured. Darius opened the door shirtless, sweat on his shoulders, a dumbbell in one hand. For a split second, he looked confused, then amused. Well, damn, he said, smirking. Pastor Carter, this is a surprise. Elijah didn't speak. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold. Darius instinctively stepped back, confused but not yet afraid. You okay, man? Something happened. Elijah's voice was quiet, steady, chilling in its composure. I know. Darius froze. No what? Elijah took one more step, the bat loose at his side. Everything. For the first time, fear flickered across Darius's eyes. Hey, look, I don't know what she told you. You touched my wife. Elijah's tone didn't rise. If anything, it dropped lower, colder. You walked into my home, into my marriage. Darius lifted both hands in a half surrender. Okay, let's just talk. Sienna said things were bad between you two. I didn't mean. Elijah's eyes hardened. You didn't mean? I listened to the messages. Darius swallowed. All right, then she came to me. I didn't force her. Elijah's jaw tightened. You didn't need to force her. All you had to do was be everything I wasn't. That's when Darius made his mistake. He scoffed. Man, maybe if you knew how to keep your woman. The world snapped. The swing came fast, years of suppressed rage exploding in a single motion. The bat connected with Darius's shoulder with a sickening crack. The dumbbell dropped. Darius stumbled backward, cursing, pain flooding his face. Elijah, what the hell? Another swing. This time the bat struck ribs. The sound was different, duller, deeper. Darius hit the side table, knocking over a lamp. His breath hitched in a sharp wheeze. Stop, man, stop. But Elijah didn't hear him. Or maybe he did, and it no longer mattered. For once in his life, Elijah wasn't praying. He wasn't reasoning. He wasn't forgiving. He was burning. Darius tried to crawl, dragging himself toward the hallway, leaving streaks on the hardwood floor. Elijah followed, slow and relentless, the bat tapping the ground with each step like a metronome marking the rhythm of violence. When Darius reached the wall, he turned, hands shaking. Elijah, listen, please. She said you didn't want her. She said you. The bat rose again. This time it came down on Darius's temple. Everything went still. The music kept playing. A drop of blood slid down the bat and fell onto the floor with a soft pat. Elijah exhaled, long, trembling, hollow. The rage that had possessed him drained all at once, leaving him dizzy, unmoored. He looked down at his hands, at the bat slick with red, and whispered the only thing his mind could form. God, forgive me. But forgiveness felt a million miles away. He placed the bat gently on the floor, almost respectfully, then walked out, leaving the front door open. The sun had risen higher now, casting warm light over a scene that had become irrevocably cold. Elijah crossed the street without looking back. He walked into the church, leaving bloody footprints on the stone steps. He approached the altar, kneeled, bowed his head, and pulled the rope that rang the bell. The sound echoed across Hawthorne. Neighbors would later say they thought it was a call to prayer. But it wasn't. It was a confession. A man announcing to the world that everything holy inside him had shattered. The arrest itself was quiet, eerily quiet. Officers walked into the church with their hats off, like they were entering a place of mourning, not a crime scene. Elijah Carter didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply lifted his hands, wrists trembling as they snapped on the cuffs. As they led him down the aisle, sunlight filtered through stained glass and painted his face in soft colors, blue, red, gold, like a final benediction for a man who no longer felt worthy of grace. By noon, the whole town knew. Hawthorne, Georgia wasn't big enough for secrets, and this one was a wildfire. The beloved pastor, gentle, soft-spoken Elijah, had beaten a man to death. And not just any man, the new neighbor, the man sleeping with his wife. At the grocery store, women gasped in front of the cereal aisle. At the barber shop, men shook their heads, arguing about guilt and provocation. At the church, some prayed for Elijah's soul, others prayed for justice, and others whispered that Sienna Carter should be charged too. Nobody agreed on anything, except that the trial was about to tear the town in half. When Elijah sat in the defendant's chair for the first pre-trial hearing, the courtroom fell into an unnatural hush. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders slumped, eyes sunken. Sienna, seated behind him, wore a black dress and trembling hands. She tried to meet his eyes, but Elijah never turned around. Not once. The prosecution came out swinging, their narrative crisp and unforgiving. Elijah Carter acted with clear intent. He walked across the street with a weapon. He entered the victim's home. He struck repeated blows. This was not passion. This was premeditated violence. Words like premeditated, weapon, lethal force filled the room like smoke. But the defense countered with a different picture. A man pushed to the brink by betrayal that shattered not just his heart, but his identity. They called it a mental break, a moment of human collapse, the unraveling of a man who had never learned how to confront pain. When jury selection began, townspeople argued outside the courthouse, half of them wearing small pins with Elijah's initials, the other half glaring, insisting the law should not bend for a pastor, even a beloved one. Sienna took the stand on the third day. She walked slowly, shoulders heavy, eyes rimmed red. When asked how the affair began, she didn't try to soften it. She didn't blame Elijah. She didn't lie. "I was lonely," she said, "and I was selfish. I betrayed my vows. But Elijah, he didn't deserve what I did. And Darius didn't deserve to die." When they played Darius and Sienna's messages aloud, the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Whisper gasps. A woman covered her ears. A man muttered a prayer. But Elijah stared straight ahead, his face carved from stone. The defense attorney asked gently, "Mrs. Carter, did Elijah ever show signs of violence before this?" "Never," she whispered. "He wouldn't kill a spider in our house. He would catch it and take it outside." A murmur spread through the room. But the prosecutor rose slowly, eyes sharp. "Mrs. Carter, your husband's gentleness doesn't erase the fact that he walked into another man's home with a bat and beat him until he no longer breathed." Sienna nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know." Next came forensic testimony. Darius suffered multiple fractures. Defensive wounds showed he tried to fight back. Blood spatter on Elijah's shirt indicated close-range strikes. But then came the character witnesses, dozens of them. Church members spoke about Elijah mentoring troubled teens, feeding the homeless, restoring broken marriages. A local mechanic told the story of Elijah giving up his own paycheck to cover repairs for a struggling single mother. A boy Elijah once counseled through bullying said, "He taught me to choose peace. That's why I can't understand what happened." And that was the heart of the trial. Nobody understood. Not the lawyers. Not the town. Not even Elijah himself. On the seventh day, Elijah finally took the stand. The room leaned forward, breath held. He didn't defend himself. He didn't ask for mercy. "My wife broke my heart," he said, voice trembling. "But I broke God's law, and I took a life. That is something I have to live with until my last breath. I'm not here to justify it. I'm here to accept what I did." The prosecutor paused, momentarily disarmed. Even she wasn't expecting that. When closing arguments ended, the jury deliberated for 9 hours. The town waited outside, split into two camps. By dusk, the verdict was read. Guilty of second-degree murder. Sentenced to 20 years. Eligible for parole after 15. A soft cry escaped Sienna. Elijah didn't react, didn't blink. But as deputies escorted him out of the courtroom, he finally turned. Just once. He looked at Sienna with a gaze so full of heartbreak, so full of something that might once have been love, that even the judge glanced away. And then he whispered something no one else heard. "I'm sorry I wasn't enough." That single sentence would haunt Sienna and the entire town for years to come. Prison didn't look the way Elijah Carter imagined it. It wasn't the cinder-block walls or the sour smell of sweat and bleach that shocked him. It was the noise. The shouting, the metal doors slamming, the echo of boots on concrete. After a lifetime spent preaching about peace, he now lived in a place where peace felt like a rumor. On his first night, a guard slid a thin mattress into his cell and said, "Lights out in 5. Elijah nodded, though he hadn't spoken a word since sentencing. When the door clanged shut, he sat on the edge of the cot, fingers interlocked, but no prayer came. For the first time in his life, he felt like God had gone silent. The other inmates whispered as they passed him during intake. The tattooed man 2 bunks down nudged his friend and muttered, "That's the pastor who beat that dude with a bat." Some looked curious, others amused, a few disgusted. Men in prison weren't impressed by sermons or gentle eyes. They respected strength, fearlessness, or madness. Elijah had none of those left. His first months dragged by in slow, suffocating waves. He barely ate. He slept only when exhaustion forced him to. When he closed his eyes, he saw the swing of the bat, the blood, the stillness that followed. Guilt pressed on him like a physical weight, making each breath feel undeserved. One afternoon in the yard, A young inmate named TJ approached him cautiously. "You really a pastor?" the boy asked, arms folded. Elijah hesitated. You don't look like no killer." Elijah lowered his gaze. Looks can lie. But the conversation, brief as it was, cracked something open. Soon, others approached him. Not because he was a murderer, but because he was quiet, non-threatening. The kind of man people instinctively confess to. Prison was full of men drowning in regrets, and Elijah knew that language intimately. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he began to listen. He helped one inmate write a letter to his daughter, helped another fill out a form for GED classes, shared his apple with a man who hadn't had a visitor in years. Word spread, not pastor, but Carter, the one who helps. And then, late one night, a guard handed him a sealed envelope. "No return address," he said. "Looks personal." Elijah studied the handwriting on the front. Delicate. Familiar? With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside was a single image, a grainy black and white ultrasound, and written beneath it, in looping cursive, "This is your daughter." The room spun. Elijah gripped the edge of his cot. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Questions crashed over him. How? When? Why now? But above all those questions was a wave of something he hadn't felt since before the trial. Hope. He lay awake that night, staring at the tiny blurred form on the paper, tracing the curve of the unborn child's head. The idea that he might have created something innocent, something untouched by betrayal and rage, became a spark in the darkness. Weeks later, Sienna finally visited. She looked older, smaller, as if the weight of her choices had settled into her bones. She sat across from him, separated by a scratched plexiglass pane, hands shaking as she lifted the phone. "Elijah, I should have told you sooner," she whispered. "Her name is Ariel. She's 5 now." Elijah pressed his palm against the glass. His voice cracked. "Does she know about me?" "No," Sienna said, "but she deserves the truth someday. And so do you." For the first time in years, Elijah cried. Not the silent tears of guilt. These were tears of gratitude, of something blooming inside him that felt almost like forgiveness. Not for Sienna, not for Darius, but for himself. After that visit, Elijah changed. He joined the prison literacy program. He volunteered in the chapel, not to preach, but to mop floors, arrange chairs, hand out soup. He started a small nightly circle called Midnight Grace, where inmates shared stories of the people they'd hurt and the people who still loved them anyway. Men who once mocked him began showing up. Some cried. Some confessed things they'd held inside since childhood. Elijah never preached at them. He simply listened. And through listening, he healed. The warden noticed. So did the parole board. His disciplinary record stayed spotless. His evaluations described him as remorseful, transformational, unlikely to reoffend. 9 years into his sentence, 6 years earlier than expected, Elijah Carter stood before a panel who asked him one final question. "What do you want to do if we release you?" He took a breath. "Live quietly, work honestly, and if she'll let me meet my daughter." The room fell silent. 2 weeks later, his release was approved. When the gates finally opened and Elijah stepped into the sunlight as a free man, he felt the warmth on his skin like a blessing he didn't deserve. But he accepted it anyway, because this wasn't the end of his punishment. It was the beginning of his rebirth. Elijah Carter had imagined freedom many ways, loud, triumphant, cleansing. But the real thing felt quiet, too quiet. The world outside the prison gates smelled different for what he remembered. Damp pine, gasoline, the faint sweetness of someone's distant laundry. He stood there with a donated canvas duffel slung over his shoulder, staring at a sky so wide it almost frightened him. For a long moment, he didn't move. Freedom was supposed to feel like a door opening. Instead, it felt like a question he wasn't sure he knew how to answer. He settled in Augusta under a new name, Elijah Ward. A friend from an old church offered him part-time HVAC repair work. Nothing fancy, nothing public. Just tired furnaces and rattling vents in small homes where nobody recognized his face. He liked that anonymity. It was the first time in years he simply existed without judgment. But every night, when the house settled and silence took over, he pulled out the same worn envelope from the top drawer. Inside was the photo of Ariel at 5 years old, gap-toothed, curly-haired, standing in a sunflower field with a doll tucked under her arm. He traced the edges with the same tenderness he once reserved for scripture. He rehearsed what he might say if he ever met her. "I'm not the man I used to be. You don't owe me anything. I loved you before I even knew you existed." But he didn't send anything. Not yet. Redemption, he believed, shouldn't be rushed. 6 months later, Sienna finally replied to his last letter. Just 2 words. 1 hour. Elijah read it 3 times before he felt the weight of what it meant. Not reconciliation. Not forgiveness. Just a door cracked open wide enough for possibility to slip through. The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon, at a park shaded by oak trees and echoing with the sounds of distant laughter. Elijah arrived early, sitting on a bench overlooking a small pond. His hand shook. His heartbeat thumped like a distant drum. He kept pressing his palms against his jeans to steady himself, but the tremor didn't stop. Then he heard it. Small footsteps. Light, unburdened. A child's voice humming off-key. Ariel. She wore a lilac dress and white sneakers that flashed when she ran. Her curls bounced with each step. She clutched a drawing folded in half. Sienna walked behind her, more cautious, more reserved, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. When she reached Elijah, she stopped a few feet away, offering a nod, guarded but not hostile. "Elijah," she said quietly. "This is Ariel." The little girl looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, eyes that mirrored his own. She studied him not with suspicion, but with the easy openness of a child who has not yet learned to fear the world. "You're Mr. Ward," she said confidently. "Mommy said you knew her a long time ago." Elijah swallowed, kneeling slowly so he wouldn't tower over her. "I did," he whispered, "and I'm really glad to meet you." Ariel smiled, bright, disarming, and held out the folded drawing. "It's us," she announced. "I made it." He opened it with shaking fingers. 2 figures beneath a big tree. One tall with gray streaks in his hair. One small with a flower in her hand. Above them, in crooked purple crayon, me and Mr. Ward. The world around him blurred. Tears welled, uninvited, uncontrollable. He blinked hard, but the emotion spilled anyway. Ariel tilted her head, confused but gentle. "Are you sad?" she asked. Elijah shook his head quickly. "No, sweetheart. I'm grateful. Children are natural healers without knowing it." Ariel simply sat next to him in the grass, swinging her legs, talking about school and her favorite cartoons and the dog she desperately wanted but wasn't allowed to have. Every word she spoke wiped away a layer of the darkness he'd been carrying for years. After a while, she reached for his hand, small fingers curling trustingly around his. He froze, stunned by how something so simple could feel so holy. Sienna watched from the bench, arms still crossed, face still guarded, but there was something softer there now, something like relief. When Ariel ran toward the swings, Sienna finally stepped closer. "She likes you," she said quietly. Elijah nodded. "I like her too, more than I know how to say." Sienna looked down. "I didn't bring you here for forgiveness. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but she deserves more than lies. And you deserve to know she exists." He nodded. "That's enough." Truly, a long pause stretched between them, heavy but not hostile this time. "She calls you Mr. Ward," Sienna added. "If you're okay with it, she can keep calling you that." Elijah smiled faintly. "It's a name I'm learning to live with." The sun began to dip behind the trees, bathing the park in gold. Ariel ran back toward them, laughing, breathless. Elijah watched her, memorizing every moment, every sound. She didn't know his past. She didn't know the blood on his hands. Children don't measure people by what they've destroyed, but by how they make them feel in the present. In that moment, she made him feel like a man worth being alive. As the visit ended, Ariel hugged him, a small, fierce squeeze around his neck. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed. When she pulled back, she whispered, "You sound like bedtime stories." The words hit him deeper than she could ever understand. Later that night, Elijah sat at his small desk, opened his journal, and wrote his final entry. Redemption did not come from God's thunder. It came from a child's hand. If Ariel is the last grace I'm ever given, then it is more than I deserve. Years later, at 21, Ariel Ward would stand at a women's conference in Atlanta and speak about resilience. When asked about the man she'd called Mr. Ward, she said, "He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who broke and spent the rest of his life becoming better than his worst moment." She paused, smiling softly, and sometimes that's enough. And so, Elijah Carter's story didn't end in a courtroom or a prison yard. It ended in the voice of the daughter who unknowingly saved him. A quiet testament that even the most shattered men can find salvation in the smallest, brightest souls.